watched this Brian Steele video. No, well, Trap Lil Ross. I'm fucking tired. Let's get to it.
House, man, we got all of the Free Dirt gang out here once again, man. Who's out here? Who's out here with the Free Dirt gang? The Free Dirt gang outside. I'm not gonna lie, it's a less hostile crowd today. Maybe that's because Brian Steele just got up there and put some belt to ass to Jam. I'm not gonna lie, we heard a lot from Jam yesterday. I feel like everybody takes their anger out on me. Like, I'm not Jam, okay? I'm not the one testifying against Dirk. I'm just trying to give the facts. But what's going on is it seems like people are cool with me. People are cool with me when Brian Steele is putting belt to ass, and that's what was going on. Brian Steele went absolutely crazy on OTF Jam. There were moments that Steele seemed like he was whooping Jam. He caught him in a couple of lies. Yeah, everybody, who's lying, who's telling the truth? Jam said a couple of things this morning that didn't add up to what he said this afternoon when Brian Steele was questioning him. So I ain't gonna lie, we see him why Brian Steele making those millions. He went pretty hard on Jam. He caught him in some contradictions, and I'm not gonna lie, Brian got pretty personal on Jam at certain points. He said a few comments to basically like call him out, saying like, this is what you do, you're a cold-blooded killer. They even said to him, there was one moment where the judge kind of like, you know, was basically saying, you get into the philosophy now, because Jam was basically saying, look, if I didn't kill Pab, if I didn't participate in this, I didn't know what I was even meant to be doing until I was flown out there. And if I said, no, where I'm from, if you stop someone getting killed, that's what gets you killed. And so Brian Steele was hitting him with these philosophical questions, being like, oh yeah, well then what makes you think that your life was worth more than somebody else's? This is just what you do, you're a cold-blooded killer. It was pretty crazy, but I'm not gonna lie, I'm gonna give you a whole bunch of updates from my notebook in separate videos. But Brian Steele went ballistic on Jam, but Jam had a few good moments where he kind of clapped back, and I'm not gonna lie, everybody comparing this to the YSL Woody situation. Jam smarter on that stand than Woody. No disrespect to Woody. I know Woody don't like me anyway, so it is what it is. But at the end of the day, I feel like Jam a lot smarter, he a lot slicker. He low-key was disrespecting Brian Steele at certain points. And Brian Steele was disrespecting him back. There were a few things that sounded kind of...
Bro, the nigga sent you on a hit. You snitched on a nigga. That nigga is cooked. I love Lil Durk, but that nigga is cooked, bro.
Improper.
Because it's like, is this case and another case?
I was a little bit confused by some of the things that were being allowed to slide, but at the same time, you see why Brian's still worth them millions, okay? He was looking sharp up there. There was a lot going on. Yesterday, it was like he was throwing a bunch of tantrums, objecting to everything. The government didn't really object too many times. They let Brian Steele have his way. They seemed pretty confident in what Jam was saying. Jam seemed pretty confident in what he was saying, but there were a few times that he got tongue-tied. So I'm going to break down all the little specific little skirmishes that happened between Brian and Jam in a bunch of separate videos. So I'm going to get to that straight after this. But you know what I'm saying? Shout out to the Free Dirt crew. There's definitely a much more positive vibe out here today, man. I was getting all kinds of like, you know, weird things said to me yesterday, but it's almost like because Brian Steele put in work, maybe I'm safe today. So shout out to Brian Steele, man. You know what I'm saying? You saved me today. But I don't know if Brian Steele gonna walk past soon. I saw him walk out yesterday, but hey, he killing it out there, man. Stay tuned for more updates. Okay, so one of the alleged lies that apparently was told by OTF Jam that was getting called out by Brian Steele apparently related to his family and the fact that he claimed that he was given help. Now, I told you guys earlier that OTF Jam said something where he was kind of probably trying to elicit a little bit of sympathy, where he basically said that he became the man of the house at 12, same age that he started doing shootings, and that he basically, you know, was putting food on the table. He was robbing people. He said that he was an armed robber, he said he was an armed robber, not a strong arm robber. And at some points, things got so real for him and his family, he had to literally stick people up with guns for food, okay? Well, Brian Steele and them kind of clapped back, and they basically, look, I was 15 minutes late. There was a lot of difficulty getting the media into the room, but we got into the room 15 minutes. So I didn't see how the prosecution's, examination of Jam ended. But what we did see is I basically walked in there and Brian was already on his ass, all right? He was already putting belt to ass. And the first thing I heard was Brian Steele say, hey, you never really supported your family, did you? Jam said, hey, if my mom was here, she would tell you. And then basically there were a bunch of sidebars, and what was crazy, something was going on, something improper had been said, they weren't happy about it, and there was a bunch of sidebars. What was crazy, I'm not gonna lie, Jam laughed, he was laughing and shaking his head. People were talking about he was shaking his head before, I see that, but hey, people were acting like he was shaking his head like, man, I can't believe I'm telling. Nah, he was laughing, shaking his head, looking at Dirk. Him and Dirk were looking at each other, smiling at each other, low-key on some like, yeah, I got you, like, hey, you, all right, we're gonna see my lawyer finna beat your ass on the stand. And what was basically crazy is that Brian Steele was forced to move on. But we actually heard at the end of the day, after the jury had left the room, apparently Brian Steele is trying to get some information across that the prosecution are having an issue with. But Brian Steele allegedly, and the defense, they're trying to basically make this case that apparently Jam's family hate him. Apparently, like, he's hated by his family. None of them are here. The judge was like, look, we don't want to be over here talking about, like, why his family aren't in the court. It's not really fair to say, why aren't your family in the court? You know, there's multiple reasons they could be there. They could be scared. They could be, you know, not there because, you know, they feel like it's too far to travel to California. They could be sick. So them not being there doesn't say anything, but it's like trying to make this case that Jam's family hate him is going to be difficult. So that kind of wasn't allowed, but it sounds like that might come back. They might find another way to attack Jam's character, but literally from the get-go, they were putting belt to ass, and Jam was laughing, shaking his head, looking over at Dirk. They were looking at each other. That was wild, but there was a lot more, and Jam went back and forth with Brian Steele. Brian Steele beat him up a little bit, and then Jam kind of hit him back. It was crazy. So stay tuned for more updates. I've got a lot more coming. So Brian Steele went down a pretty predictable path of trying to attack OTF Jam today. It didn't quite go his way, but he definitely did make a good point. One of the most obvious things that we knew we was going to hear regarding Jam was obviously his cooperation. Now, he's copped out to 3 murders, and, you know, obviously he is expecting something in exchange for cooperating and, you know, trying to help put Dirk away. Now, Brian Steele said, you're testifying under an agreement, right? You hope to be released. And then Jam was basically like, not released, I'm looking for something. And then Brian Steele's like, do you want to be incarcerated? He said, look, you do the crime, you do the time, I just don't want the rest of my life though. He basically said, I want to be free at some point, and he would refuse to say that he was expecting a specific amount of time. He basically just said, look, I want numbers, I don't want my whole life. And Brian Steele was hitting him back. He said, hey, well, I heard that you told one of your loved ones that you only expect to serve 18 months. And Jam was like, someone I love? What? Who are you talking about? He said, you told your wife on a jail call you was only expecting to be in there for 18 months and you're going to be in home for the you know, for one of your kids' birthdays. And he basically said, I don't remember saying that. I don't know what you're talking about. And it was interesting because it's like, I thought Brian Steele was about to introduce some evidence to that, but then he didn't. He kind of moved on. But then he continued on talking. I'm not going to lie. I think he was striking fear into the hearts of the jury. The idea that this guy who allegedly, not even allegedly, he's admitted to catching 3 bodies, might just be back out here on the streets. But it was basically made clear that he wasn't planning, he wasn't expecting to be out soon. You know, Brian Steele's saying, what, you thought you could manipulate your way to get out of custody? You've been in and out of custody your whole life. You understand the criminal system. You're street smart. He said, I'm street smart, but I never said I understood the criminal system. So another thing that Brian Steele said, he said to Jam, he said, look, now you're on the witness stand, you're hoping you'll get back on the street. Apparently Jam said, yeah, I guess. And they said, well, you're the reason why Dirk's in court. And after that, he basically said, well, no, I just told the truth. Brian Steele said the truth's going to be decided by the public or the jury. And then he said, you're begging and hoping for a guilty verdict on Dirk so that you can get out. Jam clapped back. He said, no, I'm not. I'm just here admitting my side and being honest. Brian Steele said, you want to go home? Jam said, look, I just want a number. I want to go home at some point. Brian Steele said, you want to go home immediately. You realize what you did. You were on this crazy mission to do murder and you're trying to get out of it. So look, to be honest, I feel like it was kind of very interesting. I feel like maybe Brian Steele thought that it was going to land harder, this whole thing of like, you're just cooperating to get out of this. But look, Jam was prepared. Jam was coming a lot more prepared than YSL Woody when it came to this questioning. Jam seemed to basically be arguing, look, I'm not expecting to get any specific amount of time. And there was even mentioned afterwards, I think there was one point where Jam actually said, look, like, judge could give me life if he wants to. Like, I don't know, I've not got any agreement. And so it's going to be very interesting to see what he ends up getting. Apparently, he might still get some time off, even if Dirk doesn't get convicted. So that was Brian Steele's angle. I don't think it necessarily landed perfectly, but like it was interesting. So there was a crazy moment in court when Brian Steele was cross-examining OTF Jam, and Brian Steele was definitely putting in some work. He was really doing his best to trash Jam's character, and he got off some very interesting points. He obviously got him to, you know, retell the situation where he had allegedly done like hundreds of armed robberies, over 100 armed robberies. And he basically very dramatically retold the story of OTF Jam's first alleged body when he was 17. He basically said, and it was very interesting, he was talking about, you know, you do armed robbery, you take advantage of situations for your benefit. Jam said, you got to explain what you mean a bit better. It's so funny because then Brian Steele said, well, look, you might want to take my watch. And then Jam said, I never stole a watch in my life. You just made up a story. What are you talking about? So OTF Jam was a lot more feisty on the stand than other people that we've seen. But Brian Steele basically told the story very dramatically. Obviously, he's very good at telling stories and building a narrative. He said at 17, you went to a store, you locked the door, you trapped your victim with you and your armed friend. Jam clapped back. He said, nah, it was only me that was armed. He said you had your gun loaded. You didn't know if the person in there had a family. You knew nothing. You just wanted to get what you wanted. And he said that when that clerk didn't want to be under your control, what did you do? Jam said, I killed him. And Brian Steele said, not just that, you blew his brains out. That was very, very dramatic, but obviously I see what he's trying to explain. Now, Brian Steele said when you blew his brains out, Jam said, yeah, I blew his brains out. When Brian Steele went on, he said, did the brains get all over you and the gun? And Jam went, well, no, that's not what happened. So Brian's still painting this picture, and Jam kind of like, bro, that's not how it went down. There wasn't no brains on me and the gun. Like, that's crazy. But then Brian Steele said, that's what you do. After he said you blow people's brains out, that's what you do. Jam said, well, that's just your opinion. And he said, you let him lay and linger. And Jam was like, what are you trying to say? I didn't do CPR? But Brian Steele, he basically said, you slaughtered a human, you took his property, and he drove back to Chicago and bragged. And Jam said, I didn't brag about it. Brian said, you thought about it? Jam said, I actually did. They said, what did you do about it? And he said, I thought about it and I called a gang meeting. They said, you ever meet with the victim's family? He said, nah. Brian Steele said, you just went on with your life. It didn't bother you? And he said, no, it did bother me. That's why I called a gang meeting. But then that was dramatically followed by him saying, you killed other people. Jam said, who? He said, Lil Dean. Jam said, you know I didn't murder him, right? And then suddenly there was a sidebar. That kind of kicked off a whole fury in the courtroom. There was then a private conversation. After that, it was made clear, basically they went back and forth. And Jam said, this was a kidnap resulting in death. I pled guilty, but I didn't pull the gun. I didn't kill him. I didn't even see him get shot. And later on, Brian Steele asked him about the Lil Pab incident and basically said, you flew out there, you didn't know, but when you were told in Hooters that you were going to kill Quando, you went along with it. Brian Steele said, murder is in your heart. It was crazy. And Jam laughed and he just went, no, it's not. And Brian said, you don't care who you hurt. He said, yes, I do. So Jam's saying that he got a heart, even though he got 3 bodies. And, you know, he's still out here. All right, so look, one of the interesting things that came up was kind of this big argument that OTF Jam was trying to make, that he didn't really want to murder Quando Rondo. Obviously, it ended up killing Lil Pab. That he didn't really want to do it. He didn't get told until he landed in California that that's what they were there for. That's the purpose that they were there for. And he kept making this argument that, like, if I didn't go along with it, where I'm from, if you stop someone killing someone, that gets you killed. Now, Brian Steele had a lot to say about that. He's saying that the facts don't really match up. He's saying that you didn't backtrack. You didn't try and stop. You had no hesitation. You landed in California, got told the plan, and your to-do list was one thing: murder. And it was interesting because he was like, look, you only even opened up and kind of, cooperated about this when you got arrested for a gun and you was trying to get out that jam. He was saying you didn't self-surrender. Your guilty conscience didn't get the better of you and cause you to walk into a police station. And he basically went on to say you didn't try and stop it. He said, I texted Dee Dee. I was trying to stop it. I didn't say stop it, but I was trying to say it's too hot. These guys ain't prepared. We don't know these guys like that. And basically, they're saying, why didn't you stop it? You're meant to be a high-ranking BD minister. You're the highest, most dangerous rank that you can possibly be. Jam clapped back. He said, look, not every minister is dangerous. And then Brian Steele was like, well, you're dangerous. And then Jam was just like, not all ministers are dangerous. And Brian Steele said, well, if you texted Dee Dee a bunch of stuff trying to stop the murder, where are those texts? Why can't you show it? He said, I can't. So I don't have my phone. I don't have them texts. And then Brian said, well, as a BD minister, you could have given the gun back and walked away. Jam said, it's not that easy. Obviously, he said previously that he was mad at Dirk. He said, I don't know why they called me. I'm not the only minister. But he said, when I came home from jail, OTF was everything and Dirk was the leader. Brian Steele said, yeah, well, according to you, but if you had a conscience, you could have just left. Jam said, it's not that easy. Brian Steele said, what, you'd rather kill a human that you didn't know than walk away? Jam said, or get killed myself. And Brian said, what, you think you're more...
Damn, so if you don't kill nobody, you gotta get killed? Kind of gang? Yo, I'm happy I ain't in no gang, son. I be saying Moolah gang, but that's just niggas I went to high school. I don't even fuck with them niggas no more. I'm just holding it down because Moolah is a part of my name, man. Unless you see me throw up the...
More important than the people you kill? Jam laughed and said no. There was a funny moment where Brian said to Jam, he said, look, you're a dangerous man, right? And he was like, he said, you're objectively a dangerous man. Jam said, I don't know what objectively means. He said, you're dangerous, like right now. And Jam laughed, he went, I'm chilling. Later on, Brian Steele basically said, why do you feel like other people should die so you don't have to die if you felt like you would be killed if you, you know, walked back from this. And basically, they were kind of talking about that. They kind of went back and forth about that. And then they said, why didn't you, you know, why didn't you stay at the scene? Like, if you were that worried. He said, look, obviously I'm not going to stay there. Nobody would just stay at the scene after committing a crime like that. No one would do that. And Brian Steele said, well, you know, you're different. You're not like everybody else. This is what you do, Mr. Minister. And basically, like, Jam laughed at that point. He said, yeah, I'm different for sure. And then he pointed at Dee and he said, well, he a minister too. And then Brian said, well, you're a professional. Jam said, we're not professionals. We're just paying attention to the situation. So there were some pretty insane claims about disrespect that Jam had apparently showed to Dirk when he was being cross-examined by Brian Steele. Now look, I don't know how true this was, and Jam denied everything. But Brian Steele made a very interesting point, right? And you could tell he was onto some shit, because Brian Steele basically brought up a woman's name. I won't say her name, all right, because it's not really important. But he basically said, you came back out of jail, you said you had no money, Dirk sorted you out some clothes, and you put your parole to an address. It was a woman's address. Brian Steele said the name and Jam laughed. He went, yeah. They said, you lived at her house. He said, look, I used her crib as a parole site, but I wasn't really living there. And they basically said, you had a sexual relationship. He said, we hooked up once, all right? Jam's basically saying, like, look, something was going on with me and her, all right? So Brian Steele basically said, look, you think she's a good person, right? Yeah? Jam said, yeah, she's a good person. And then Brian Steele dropped the bomb. He said, did you tell her that Dirk is your bitch? He said, I never said that. And then Brian Steele said, you told her Dirk is a hoe. He said, never. And then Brian Steele said, by the time you got out, Dirk's career was booming. And you said that he owes you because he used your name in so many songs. He basically, Jam kind of kicked off. He was like, that makes no sense. How could I be responsible? How could I be claiming that I was responsible for his success? He only mentioned me in a couple of songs. They weren't even his biggest songs. That ain't making no sense. He was clapping back at Brian Steele. Then Brian Steele said, I know. This was crazy. He was like, this ain't making no sense. Brian Steele was like, I know, you often don't make sense. It was like, oh, that was a burn. Brian Steele then clapped back. He said, you said that Dirk works for you. Jam said, no, I didn't. He said, you said that you were going to get rich from Dirk. He said, no. He basically said, you were in a studio in Atlanta. Dirk took you and others to that private room. And that's when they told you Quando has to be killed. So it was kind of like he set him up with a bunch of stuff that he was going to then deny. And then he hit him with the big doozy, which was obviously this whole thing about, you know, Dirk had said that there was $1 million bounty, all of that kind of stuff. And basically, he was saying that, you know, that's what you said in your testimony, right? But you didn't say it in your interview. Now, that was crazy. He kind of caught him in a lie. And then they played a segment of a recorded federal interview with OTF Jam. And basically, he said that Dirk had actually never spoken to him about Quando, never spoken to him about no bounty, that they hadn't had the conversation about that before the murder. It was a big contradiction, and it made Jam look really bad. In light of all the stuff that he had just said, they brought up a bunch of statements of him disrespecting Dirk, basically painting the picture that he denied of, like, being jealous of Dirk's success and thinking Dirk's a hoe and thinking he was going to get money out of Dirk. Jam was clapping back. He was basically saying, yeah, I didn't say it in that interview, but there's more to the story than that. You taking little segments of the interview and you painting a narrative, but there's way more to the story than that. But he, unfortunately, Brian Steele was smart. He never actually let Jam kind of get to that part of the story, but maybe we'll hear it tomorrow.
Yo, that's a lot, chat. Now, my thing about this whole case is I be thinking, like, Jam is cooking them. Like, if you have a nigga that basically says, yo, this nigga made me kill these niggas, and there's a reason why, and I don't even know the reason why he got me killing these niggas, it's like you contradicting yourself, but you also digging a grave for a nigga. Jam, if they give you 20, 30 years, this snitching was not worth it. This was just because niggas killed your baby mother. But we're going to see, man. Tomorrow, I'm going to give you guys some updates, so make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe, turn your bell notifications on, because we drop videos every single day. I appreciate everybody for tuning in. I got one more video on this channel. I want to do 3 videos on each channel every day, just trying to stay very, just, you know, attentive to what's going on. So make sure you guys hit that sub button. We're on the road to 50,000.